The Silk Road was more than a network of trade. It was the central nervous system of a civilization. Through its arteries flowed not just silk and spices, but ideas, philosophies, and art. In the early 13th century, its heart beat strongest in the Khwarazmian Empire, a jewel of the Islamic Golden Age. But when the Mongol armies arrived, they transformed this artery of culture into a conveyor of human misery, creating a new, tragic commodity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. When Genghis Khan unleashed his armies upon the Khwarazmian Empire in 1219, it was an act of calculated total war. This was not a border skirmish. It was an apocalypse. The Khwarazmian Shah, Ala al-Din Muhammad, ruled an empire famed for its staggering sophistication. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench were global centers of learning. Their libraries held the world's knowledge. Their workshops produced the finest steel, paper, and textiles. Their madrasas and observatories housed the greatest minds in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. The Mongols, masters of the steppe, possessed a brilliant and brutal military machine. But they knew what they lacked. They lacked the infrastructure of a sedentary empire. They had no class of administrators to levy taxes, no engineers to build cities, no artisans to create the luxuries of imperial power, and no scholars to record their deeds for posterity. The Khwarazmian Empire, in its tragic splendor, was a treasure chest of precisely this human talent. And so, the harvest began. As each city fell, we see from the chronicles, from Juvaini to Rashid al-Din, that the Mongol Tumen commanders enacted a chillingly consistent policy. This was not the random, chaotic pillage of a barbarian horde. It was a systematic, state-level resource assessment. After the populations were driven onto the plains, the sorting began. The useless, the elderly, the infirm, the unskilled laborers deemed too difficult to manage were often summarily executed. This was a cold calculation, a culling of liabilities. But the useful were meticulously identified and segregated. We must analyze what useful meant to the Mongol war machine. It meant anyone with a skill that could serve the new empire. Weavers, blacksmiths, armorers, tanners, physicians, scribes, accountants, painters, musicians, and astronomers. The Persian chroniclers write with horror of how the learned men of their society, doctors and judges, were roped together like livestock. This process was the legal and physical creation of a new commodity. Under the authority of the great Yasa, these individuals were stripped of their names, their families, and their legal personhood. They ceased to be Nasir al-Din, the astronomer, or Fatima, the weaver. They became Ulusun Bo'ol, slaves of the state. They were now imperial property, assets belonging to the golden family of Genghis Khan, to be distributed as he saw fit. This was the first step in one of the largest and most brutal forced technology transfers in human history. The value of this new human cargo was beyond measure. A single siege engineer, captured from Nishapur, was worth more than 1,000 unskilled captives. A skilled translator or administrator who understood the complexities of a sedentary tax system, was invaluable for turning a conquered territory into a productive province. The Mongol leadership was acutely aware of this. We have records of specific orders being given to spare artisans. After the catastrophic siege of Urgench, the capital, Giovanni tells us that over 100,000 artisans were rounded up and deported en masse to the eastern countries, to the Mongol heartland. The rest of the population, numbering perhaps over 1 million, was massacred. This was not a paradox, it was policy. The Mongols destroyed the vessel, the city, but carefully preserved its most precious content, the human skill inside it. This Persian harvest, as we can call it, was not a one-time event. It was a continuous process that lasted for decades, creating a vast pool of displaced, enslaved talent. This was the raw material that would build the Mongol Empire. But this material was in Persia, and the demand for it was thousands of miles away, in the new capitals of the Khans. The harvest was over. The journey was about to begin. The sorting was complete. The cities of Khwarazmia were smoldering ruins, and on the plains outside, a new, terrible migration was being organized. We must erase from our minds any image of a wandering band of refugees. What followed the Persian harvest was one of the most organized, systematic, and brutal logistical operations of the 13th century, the deportation of a skilled nation. This human cargo was, in the eyes of the Mongol administration, an imperial asset, and it was moved with the same ruthless efficiency as any other resource. The captives were organized into units of tens, arvans, and hundreds, zuns, placed under the command of Mongol military detachments. They were, in effect, a new kind of army, an army of the unfree, marching not to conquer, but to build their conqueror's world. Their route was the Silk Road. But this was not the journey of a merchant caravan, laden with silks and spices, scheduling its stops at comfortable caravanserai. This was a death march. We must consult the records, but also use our historical imagination to understand the sheer horror of this passage. The journey from Persia to the Mongol heartland, first to Karakorum under Ogadai, and later, more permanently, to Kublai Khan's new capital in China, was a journey of thousands of miles. It led them east, out of the ruins of their homeland, across the Oxus River, and into the vast, unforgiving deserts and steppes of Central Asia. Chroniclers like Giovanni, himself a survivor who entered Mongol service, write of the columns of captives stretching to the horizon. They were force-marched. Those who faltered, the sick, the weak, the elderly, who had somehow survived the initial cull, were not rescued. They were left to die on the roadside. The yasa was clear: a guard who allowed a captive to escape, or who failed to maintain the pace, could himself face execution. The system was designed for maximum throughput, and human life was the most expendable part of the equation. The mortality rate was, by all estimates, catastrophic. This journey was itself a brutal filter. Only the strongest, the most resilient, or perhaps the most valuable, those physicians or engineers given slightly better treatment to ensure their survival, would complete the trek. They were driven through the scorching summers and freezing winters of the Taklamakan Desert and the Tian Shan Mountains. And we must ask, what was the logistical mechanism for such a transfer? The Mongols used their famed YAM system. The YAM was the Imperial Relay Network, a series of postal stations with fresh horses, food, and guards that connected the empire. It was the information superhighway of its day. But the yam stations also served as holding pens and resupply points for the transfer of imperial property, and that now included human beings. A column of captive artisans would be marched from one yam station to the next, a fresh guard taking over, new supplies of water and grain requisitioned from the local, subjugated population. The Silk Road was, for them, a trail of tears, a chain of fortified points leading them inexorably east, further and further from any hope of return. Their destination was, at first, the new imperial capital of Karakoram. Travelers like William of Rubruck, visiting in the 1250s, were astonished to find a cosmopolitan city rising from the steppe, filled with artisans from around the world. He famously described a Parisian silversmith and a magnificent silver tree fountain he built for the Khan. That Parisian was a captive. The city's mosques were built by captive Persian architects. Its walls were raised by captive Chinese engineers. It was a monument to Mongol power, built entirely by the enslaved. But the true, systematic destination for this Persian cargo was to be the empire of Kublai Khan, the Yuan dynasty. When Kublai completed his conquest of China, he faced a profound administrative problem. He was a foreign conqueror ruling over the most populous, ancient, and culturally complex civilization on Earth. He deeply distrusted the native Han Chinese, and especially the newly conquered Southern Song, whom he feared would never be loyal. He needed a class of administrators, tax collectors, financiers, and scientists who were loyal only to him. The Mongols, as nomads, could not provide this. The Chinese, he would not trust. The solution? The Semu Ren. This is a crucial moment of legal classification. The Yuan dynasty legally divided its population into a four-tiered caste system. At the very top were the Mongols, the military and political elite. At the very bottom were the Nan Ren, or Southerners, the 80 million Han Chinese of the former Song dynasty, who had virtually no political rights. Just above them were the Han Ren, the Northern Chinese. And in the second highest position, slotted directly beneath the Mongols themselves, was a new category, the Semu Ren, or people with colored eyes. This was the legal designation for all foreigners and non-Chinese subjects, Uyghurs, Turks, and, most importantly for our story, the thousands of Persian and Central Asian captives and their descendants. Here, we must analyze the profound, terrible irony of their situation. Our Persian artisan, scientist, or scribe, who had been violently enslaved and force-marched across a continent, was now legally superior to the native Chinese population. This was not freedom. It was a new, more sophisticated form of servitude. As Semu Ren, these Persians were given immense functional power. They were appointed as governors, finance ministers, tax collectors, and directors of state workshops. They were the perfect tools of empire. They were rootless, far from home, with no local power base. They could not appeal to the Chinese population, who viewed them as foreign oppressors. They had no support from a homeland, which no longer existed. Their lives, their wealth, and their privileged legal status were derived entirely from the grace of the great Khan. They were, in effect, a captive elite, bound to their master by a golden chain. Their very privilege was the mechanism of their control. They were the ultimate instruments of the Yuan state, tasked with administering, taxing, and controlling the vast Chinese population on behalf of their Mongol masters. This gilded cage of the Semu Ren was a legal and social masterpiece of imperial control. We must be precise. These Persian administrators and scientists were not allies of the Mongols. They were high-functioning tools. Their lives in the Yuan court, particularly in Kublai's new capital, Dadu, the city we now know as Beijing, were a study in profound cognitive dissonance. When we examine the Yuan records, we see them everywhere. Their names, even when sinicized, betray their origins. They were the architects of Dadu. When Kublai Khan decided to build a capital that would dwarf Karakoram and project his image as a true Chinese emperor, he did not turn to the Chinese he had just conquered. He turned to his Semu Ren, Muslim architects, engineers, and planners, many of them from this Persian captive pool, or their immediate descendants, designed the city's wide grid-like streets, its massive earthen walls, and its opulent palaces. They were, quite literally, building the very capital of the dynasty that held them in bondage. Their most significant impact, however, was in finance and administration. The Yuan state needed to extract wealth from China's vast agricultural economy. The Mongols, unfamiliar with sedentary economics, deployed their Semu Ren as their financial architects. Figures like Ahmad Fanakati, a Central Asian who rose to become Kublai's chief finance minister, implemented a system of state monopolies on salt, iron, and tea, and reformed the tax code. He was ruthlessly effective, funneling staggering wealth into the Khan's treasury. But this power was the very definition of a double-edged sword. To the Han Chinese, men like Ahmad were the face of the occupation. Foreign agents, cruel, corrupt, and avaricious. This was, in fact, a key part of their function. By placing Semu Ren in these high-visibility, unpopular roles, the Mongol Khans insulated themselves from the hatred of the populace. The Semu Ren served as a political lightning rod. And when public anger boiled over, as it did with Ahmad Fanakati, who was assassinated in 1282, the Khan could simply disavow him, execute his co-conspirators, and replace him with another, just as dependent, official. Their power was immense, but their position was exquisitely precarious. Perhaps the most surreal example of this captive science was in the field of astronomy. The emperor's power in China was tied to his role as the son of heaven, responsible for maintaining cosmic and terrestrial harmony. This required a perfect calendar. Kublai Khan, a deeply pragmatic man, knew that Persian astronomy was, at the time, the most advanced in the world. So, he did not simply consult Persian astronomers. He imported them and institutionalized their knowledge as a state-controlled asset. In 1271, Kublai established the Hui Shijian, the Muslim Astronomical Bureau, inside his new capital. This was not a department of a Chinese university. It was a state organ, staffed by captive astronomers like Jamal al-Din, who had been brought from Bukhara. Jamal al-Din presented Kublai with a set of advanced astronomical instruments, far superior to many existing Chinese models, and a new, more accurate calendar. We must analyze the structure here. This Muslim bureau operated in parallel with the traditional Chinese astronomical bureau. The two were ordered to share data and compete for the most accurate predictions, all for the benefit of the Khan. The Yasa's principle of the Ulasun Bool, the state-owned skilled slave, is on full display. The Persian scientific knowledge was not integrated. It was segregated, ring-fenced, and turned into a proprietary tool of the emperor. These men, who had once mapped the stars in the great observatories of Persia, were now astronomers in residence to a foreign master, their science reduced to a function of statecraft, their lives forfeit. This was the human experience of the Semu Ren. They lived in lavish compounds. They wore robes of silk. They advised the most powerful man on earth. But they were, and always remained, exiles and property. They could not go home. Their community was an island in a vast and often hostile Chinese sea. Their children would be born Semu Ren, their fate still tied to the whim of the Khan. When the Yuan dynasty began to crumble in the mid-14th century, this gilded cage became a death trap. As Han Chinese rebellions, like the Red Turbans, rose up, they did not distinguish between the Mongol master and the Semu Ren administrator. Both were barbarians, foreign oppressors to be expelled. When the Mongols were driven out and the Ming dynasty was established, this entire class of Central and West Asians was cut off. They were a people twice stranded, unable to return to a Persia that no longer existed for them, and despised in their adopted land. This, then, is the final, tragic legacy of the Persian harvest. Their skills built a dynasty. Their knowledge enriched a continent. The flow of Islamic science, medicine, and art they brought to China, even as captives, sparked a unique and lasting cultural synthesis. Their descendants would eventually assimilate, forming the nucleus of many of today's Hui Muslim communities in China. But the original cargo itself, those men and women of the Khwarazmian Empire, were consumed by the very empire they were forced to build. The Silk Road, which had been their people's monument to commerce and culture, had been for them a one-way road to a life of magnificent, brilliant, and inescapable servitude. The journey ends here, in the quiet courtyards and abandoned observatories of Dadu. The human cargo had been delivered, and in the end, fully consumed by the state it created. It is a haunting reminder that a person's skill, their very genius, can be the most valuable commodity for an empire and the heaviest chain for the individual.